Hello, everyone, and welcome to MAP Forum. I'm Nagar Okar, and I have the pleasure of hosting the weekly webinars for the Medici Archive project. Today, I'm delighted to welcome my friend and co-panelist at RSA in Boston last week, Benedetta Chizzolini, who was an Eva Schleyer Fellow last year at the Medici Archive project in 2024, and she's currently a postdoctoral researcher at Tel Aviv University. She's joining us today from Florence, our beautiful Florence, and she's going to share her postdoctoral research project with us today. Benedetta, thank you so much for accepting our invitation. We're so happy to have you here.
Thank you so much, Nagal. Thank you also for the MAP for inviting me, and for all of you who are at home watching this paper.
Of course, the whole screen is yours.
My whole screen. So let me just share the screen. So as Nagar introduced, this is part of my postdoctoral research at the Tel Aviv University within the RC project Female Slavery in Mediterranean Catholic Europe, 1500 and 1800. And tonight I'm going to present a paper that is actually an abstract of an article that is currently under revision. So I want to start with a brief historiographical premise by saying that historiography of Mediterranean slavery has traditionally focused on male captivity, often overlooking the presence and agency of enslaved women. So this paper challenges this androcentric perspective by examining the experiences of some enslaved women from Bona, today Annaba, captured during the Tuscan raid of 1607 and held in Livorno and Pisa. Through an analysis of petitions, acts of defiance, and negotiations for ransom, these studies demonstrate how these women, despite their marginalized status, actively resisted their enslaved condition. Their collective actions, ranging from formal players to disruptive protests such as arson, reveal the diverse strategies enslaved women employ to assert agency within oppressive system. So, between the 16th and the 19th century, an estimated 2 million people were enslaved in Catholic territories of the Mediterranean. These individuals came from diverse backgrounds, with the European historiography traditionally highlighting their non-Catholic status as a key factor in their enslavement. However, many captives were also Christians from Eastern Europe, as well as Moriscos, that is, forcibly baptized Muslims, and Jews. A significant portion were prisoners of war, seized by Catholic corsairs during naval battles or military raids, while others were bought in established slave markets. Most enslaved people came from Eastern Mediterranean and North Africa. However, there was also a notable presence of individuals from sub-Saharan Africa, many of whom had been captured in local conflicts and were later sold to Ottoman and European traders along trans-Saharan caravan routes and in key Atlantic ports such as those of Lisbon and Cadiz. Additionally, numerous women from the Balkans fell victim to slave traffickers who abducted them and transported them to Italy. In the last few decades, European historiography has emphasized the concept of reciprocity inherent in the Mediterranean concerning wars. That is, the possibility for both Muslims and Catholics to be enslaved in the Mediterranean and to be released or exchanged for other captives. This focus has not only reduced Mediterranean slavery to the notion of Mediterranean captivity, but also contributed to the creation of a golden legend about Mediterranean countries essentially free from slavery, and that human bondage in the Mediterranean was milder than Atlantic slavery. This perspective also fostered a strongly androcentric view of early modern Mediterranean slavery, focusing almost exclusively on enslaved men, particularly of those serving on the galleys. In contrast, female slavery, though often well documented, has remained an unexplored phenomenon. The first steps toward gender in the history of slaveries were taken in recent decades and were related to the Atlantic context. In particular, much attention was paid to the sexual component of female slavery, recognizing the risks of sexual exploitation as an intrinsic feature of it. Simultaneously, historians of slavery, influenced by feminist scholarships, began focusing on the agency of enslaved women, where agency encompassed the various, sometimes subtle, forms of resistance employed by enslaved people to improve their condition, even if only marginally. These recognize the status of enslaved individuals as active subjects, as opposed to the traditional image of the enslaved person, and women in particular, as passive objects subjugated to their usually male owners. In contrast to the Atlantic world, female slavery in the Mediterranean has only recently begun to receive greater scholarly attention, thereby challenging the traditional image that considers female slavery absent in the Mediterranean during the early modern period. Indeed, the primary challenge in studying female slavery in the early modern Mediterranean is the paucity of archival records detailing the lives of enslaved women. This paucity has in turn contributed to the misconception that enslaved women and girls were a marginal presence in Mediterranean societies, and that their role was of less significance compared to their male counterparts. The scarcity of information is not simply a matter of archival gaps, but also the result of the social and legal positioning of enslaved women as objects rather than subjects. Their voices, when they appear at all, are rarely heard directly. Enslaved people in general, and bondswomen in particular, were often denied the agency to testify, documenting their experience, or even leave a trace of their identities. Nevertheless, over the past 2 decades, some historians have successfully employed the microhistorical method to overcome the male-centered and patriarchal lens that has traditionally shaped the history of slavery. In particular, for studying enslaved women, agency is a central concept in order to challenge the often exclusive emphasis on the victimization and passivity of both women and enslaved person. The concept of agency has become a foundational idea in historical research, particularly since the rise of the new social history in the 1970s. During this period, historians began challenging traditional narratives that depicted individuals and groups, especially race, gender, or class, leading to their subordination to the power exerted by the white male elites. Obviously, while the concept of agency is a valuable framework for historical analysis, it is important to exercise caution in its application. To assert that members of subordinated and persecuted groups had agency does not imply that they possess complete freedom of action. Instead, it acknowledged that their ability to act was heavily constrained by the oppressive systems in which they were embedded. Despite these limitations, enslaved women found ways to respond to their circumstances, and examples that I will discuss could offer some example. So, as I said before, the case study is that of the conquest of Bona. Sorry. Okay. So the conquest of the city of Bona by the Tuscan fleet resulted from an act of piracy against some knights of the Order of St. Stephen. Shipwrecked off the coast of the Maghreb, the knights were captured, beheaded, and their heads nailed to the walls of the town of Bona, one of the most important Muslim strongholds in North Africa. Thus, the conquest of Bona would have been revenge for the slain knights and a significant victory in the war between Christianity and Islam. On August 30, 1607, Tuscan galleys and galleons embarked on their expedition, reaching Bona on September 15. Despite several logistical challenges, the town was eventually captured after a fierce battle of 6 hours. Among the spoils of war, there were 1,500 slaves, men, women, and children. The able-bodied men were destined to serve as oarsmen on the galleys, while all the others, along with the women and children, were to be sold at markets in Cagliari, in Sardinia, an intermediate stop to the journey back to Tuscany, and Livorno. However, not all the enslaved people were sold. Consequently, the unsold men were confined to the bagno in Livorno, while the women and children were sent to the arsenal in Pisa. Okay. So this is an image from the conquest of Bona. There are the slaves from Bona who are brought to Tuscany and as part of the booty to the Grand Duke. And here on the right there is the Livorno Bagno dei Forzati, and on the left the Pisa's arsenal. So the Bagno dei Forzati was a prison built between 1598 and 1604 by the order of the Grand Duke Ferdinando I de' Medici, and based on the model of the Bagni of Constantinople and Algiers. This was actually a prison where galley rowers, both convicts and enslaved, were imprisoned and locked during nights during the navigational period. The Arsenal of Pisa, on the other hand, was a complex of buildings dedicated to the constructions and repair of Medici galleys, particularly before Livorno supplanted Pisa as the main port of Tuscany. With the decline of the port of Pisa and the subsequent shift of port and commercial activities to Livorno in the 16th century, the Arsenal of Pisa lost much of its strategic importance. In the 17th century, as the fleet declined and the need for galley construction diminished, a significant portion of the arsenal was destroyed. The remaining structures were repurposed into warehouses, armament factories, and workshops for land defense in response to the new defensive needs of the city and the surrounding territory. Although built for different purposes compared to the Bagno of Livorno, the Arsenal of Pisa also housed enslaved men who, unable to run the galleys due to physical or health impairments, but still healthy enough to work, were sent to Pisa and assigned to forced labor in the city's port and arsenal. Probably the decision to confine women in the arsenal were due for purely logistical reasons. Indeed, although there were also many men in the arsenal, the situation was not comparable to that of Livorno, where sources describe the Bagno as a place of constant overcrowding, leading both to poor hygiene and promiscuity. So in order to preserve what was perceived to be the honor of the enslaved women, so their sexual reputation, it was therefore necessary to separate and isolate them in a space reserved exclusively for them, so in the arsenal. The case study that I'm going to analyze right now, it's actually has already been analyzed in the first years of the 90s, 80s by Vittorio Salvadorini. So it's a case that is actually already known, even though Salvadorini analyzed it only from an economic point of view. While my purpose here is to readdress and reanalyze this case and the sources available from a gender perspective. So coming back to the women of Bona, after 1 year of the siege, so in 1608, some of the enslaved in the people from Bona were still unsold and still imprisoned in Livorno and Pisa. In particular, around 150 women were kept in the arsenal of Pisa under the jurisdiction of the provveditore, so the superintendent of the arsenal, Francesco Salviati. It is noteworthy that the source constantly refers specifically to female slaves, so to schiave, even though the slave registry indicates the presence also of children and adolescents of both sexes. Probably this discrepancy can be attributed to the social and legal perception that young boys were not considered adults until they reached a certain age that was usually around 21 years old. So to avoid financial loss from the failure to sell those people and the subsequent expenditure of public funds on their maintenance, the Medici authorities entered into agreement with the Muslim broker Haji Yusuf from Bona and with the Jewish merchant Sima Levi. They both were merchants based in Livorno, engaged in trade on both sides of the Mediterranean, and notably specialized in the ransom of captives. On October 15, 1608, after being examined by the physician in charge of determining the slaves' commodified value, that was the doctor Benedetto Borromei, it was set the ransom price for the slaves, both for old and young women as well as small children, in Italian tra donne giovani e vecchie ragazzetti piccoli, and the price was set at 60 gold scudi each, in addition to taxes for their release and maintenance cost. On December 16, the two merchants jointly undertook the obligation to pay the ransom within 6 months. Their task was to travel to Bona, gather funds or valuables from the families of the enslaved persons to cover their ransom, and personally advance any remaining amount, charging a 25% interest on the sum they committed to paying beyond what had been provided by the contracting party. So the decision to establish a uniform price for all enslaved women, irrespective of age or health, which determine their working capacities, actually represents a distinctive choice within the economy of Mediterranean redemption. In the process of determining the sale or ransom price of a slave, a procedure that was referred to as the cutting of the slave, in Italian, taglio degli schiavi, evaluating the enslaved person's health condition was considered paramount. Consequently, a physical examination was routinely required. The use of medical expertise to assess the health of enslaved people was an age-old practice and a critical component of the transaction process involving the buying, selling, or redeeming them. Like any other commercial transaction, the exchange of enslaved individuals was an economic act, entailing the exchanges of goods at an agreed-upon price and the transfer of rights and ownership. To ensure the fairness of the price and the legitimacy of the legal transfers, most buyers relied on medical professionals who were enlisted to inspect the physical health and attributes of slaves on the market. This practice was similarly applied in ransom cases to guarantee that captives were not freed for less than their highest commodified value. So the decision to set a standard relatively low price for the unsold enslaved women of Bona was driven by the need to maximize the chances of ransom, offering an affordable price to their relatives in Bona who, only 1 year earlier, had been devastated by war and were in a state of severe poverty. The two merchants went to Bona, and since Haji Yusuf had to remain there for personal matters, the responsibility of transporting the money and the letters and wax for the ransom payments fell to Sima Levi, who arrived in Livorno in August 1609. According to the report drafted by Ugolino Barisoni, the commissioner of the galleys, Sima delivered the letters and the wax to the city's Lazzaretto, where they were to be used for the ransom of 44 of the enslaved individuals from Bona, 38 women, while the remaining 6 persons being adolescents and children who were held in Pisa. However, since Sima had also undertaken the tasks of ransoming other privately held enslaved individuals in Pisa and had no space to accommodate enslaved women in the meantime, he asked Barisoni the favor to temporarily housing them at the Bagno of Livorno, in a separate dormitory from the men, until he returned and could undertake the trip back to Bona. However, Sima Levi never returned to Livorno from Pisa. Upon his arrival in Pisa, he was arrested by one of his creditors, the merchant Razzo Botteghesi. Sima died in prison between September 26 and 27, 1609, and a legal procedure was initiated to determine whether letters, wax, and money he had brought from Bona should be allocated to his creditors or if they should be paid to the Grand Duke's coffers for the ransom of the enslaved women. So, while it's not my aim to reconstruct the trial, which, as I said, has been already analyzed by Vittorio Salvadorini in 1902, which actually ruled in favor of the Grand Duke, and so in favor of the enslaved women, my primary interest lies in examining the reaction of the enslaved Muslim women to Sima death and the potential scenario in which they might not regain their freedom. So the news of Sima Levi's demise caused considerable turmoil among the women from Bona who were housed in Livorno's Bagno. As Ugolino Barisoni reported, upon his arrival at the Bagno, he was surrounded by the women who, in a state of despair, were screaming, scratching their faces, and pulling their hair, demanding to be manumitted. They were terrified by the prospect that all the money that their relatives in Bonn had paid for the ransom might be lost, thus condemning them to live the rest of their lives under slavery. The 44 women handed him a petition claiming that the goods that Sima brought to Livorno were meant to pay the ransom. Barisoni supported their players and added letters written in Ottoman Turkish and translated into Italian, in which various relatives of the women in question affirmed that they had delivered to Sima Levi for the women's ransom over 50, 60, or 100 letters, and so on. What is interesting to me is the tone, the language that Barisoni used to describe the enslaved women's behavior. After Levi's death, as I just said, he seems to express some empathy for the women's desperation of their fate of continuous enslavement. Nonetheless, just 2 weeks later, Barisoni complained that he is harassed, importunato, by the enslaved women on a daily basis. He then asked the Grand Duke to consider Levi's possession as a payment for the ransom in order to be relief also by this by this trouble that they were causing him. And indeed, the Barisoni's choice of the term to harass is actually quite strong and suggests a significant level of annoyance and impatience on the part of the commissioner of the galley, indicating that the women's suffering was met with frustration rather than compassion. This implies not only that, as Barisoni himself claimed, that the plays were daily, but also that they become increasingly insistent, both in terms of their frequency and intensity of their tone. Indeed, the term harassment was commonly employed by the authorities of Livorno when addressing the players of enslaved individuals. Thus, for example, in the same year, the governor of Livorno, Antonio Martelli, brought to the Grand Duke requesting relief from the harassment caused by the persistent petitions submitted by Donna Isabella della Madre di Dio. Isabella, who was a formerly enslaved Muslim who had converted to Christianity, was described as the favorite of the Spanish ambassador. Having arrived in Livorno probably with the same women from Bona, in 1608 Isabella was separated from her daughter, whom Sima Levi sold to the merchant Manfredini for 550 pezze. Manfredini claimed to have freed the girl, who was captured by pirates while on her way back to Algiers and taken to Corsica. There she converted to Christianity and began a new life as a Christian. The governor described Isabella as extremely passionate in speech, arditissima nel parlare, if not inappropriate, and considered it absurd that he had to contend daily with such harassment, caused not only by a woman, but from one who was formerly an enslaved person. The women from Bona were not discouraged by the lack of practical outcomes of their players to Barisoni, and even dared to go farther. And as early as October 1st, 1609, the women sent a written petition to the Grand Duke outlining their plight, how they had been valued at 60 scudi each, and how Sima Levi and Haji Yusuf had jointly undertaken the responsibility for their ransom. They detail how, upon returning with the ransom payment, not only did Sima die, but the goods were seized by the merchants of Livorno to whom he was in debt, claiming that these creditors, in violation of the law, sought to sell the goods for their profit. The enslaved women expressed their claims with determination, yet addressed the Grand Duke with reverence and respect, invoking his benevolence and sense of justice. On November 9, the slaves Buttareb, son of Ali from Bona, together with the women Arziga, Fatima, and Yasmina, sent another petition to the Grand Duke on behalf of all the enslaved men, women, and children who were still held in Livorno and Pisa. They asked Cosimo II to acknowledge that the sum required for their ransom had been delivered by Sima, and therefore to grant their freedom. So the fact that enslaved individuals could cause disorder both verbally and through their actions was also testified in Pisa. As reported by Francesco Salviati in a letter to the Grand Duke, around September 15, 1610, one of the enslaved women from Bona was caught by the guards scraping the planks of her bed, breaking them, and setting them on fire. The guard reprimanded her by slapping her twice. After ordering an inspection, It was discovered that other beds were also missing several planks and numerous blankets that had been cut, burned, and discarded, all out of spite. E tutto per dispetto. These acts of defiance, however, were not merely acts of destruction, but expression of frustration and resistance against their captivity. Notably, there is a clear escalation in enslaved women's actions. Following the death of Sima Levi, they initially expressed the despair through self-inflicted wounds stretching their faces in grief. Over time, however, the sorrow transformed into overt defiance, shifting from the self-harm to explicit acts of vandalism against state property. The women, who refused to accept their status as property of the Grand Duke and instead asserted that they were humans who should be freed from enslavement, were perceived as a growing threat to the stability of the arsenal. To suppress their rebellion and punish what was deemed to be their arrogance, Giovanni Moscate, the head of the guards, ordered them to be beaten to restore control. This violent response underscores the extreme measures taken to silence enslaved women who dared to resist their subjugated condition. Later that day, the merchant Muhammad ibn Faraj, known in Tuscany as Mehmet Faraj, came to dine at the arsenal. Mehmet Faraj was a Valencian Morisco, a merchant in the service of the Sultan, involved in the ransom of enslaved Muslims who were captured during the Crusading Wars. Upon hearing the account from the enslaved women about what had happened earlier that morning, Ibn Faraj began shouting at the guards, calling them faithless dogs and 1,000 other filthy names. After further complaints, Ibn Faraj went to Francesco Salviati, insulting and showing him disrespect. Salviati, in his letter to the Grand Duke, reports how he endured the insults with great patience to avoid further problems. And the letter, that is clearly written apologetically, defending himself against the accusation made. This letter is clearly written apologetically, defending himself against the accusation made by the Muslim merchants. In response to the accusation, Salviati records that he had been in charge of the arsenal for 5 years and that no enslaved person had ever lodged a complaint against his conduct. Specifically, the one from Bona had no reason to take offense against him or engage in acts of vandalism, as they had been treated as nuns and not as slaves. Indeed, one of the main accusations made by Ibn Faraj was that 92 women held in Pisa are mistreated, forced to work for the Provveditore, and are unable to relieve their burdens. They also lament about the possible damage to their honor, meaning that the women were distressed over issues related to their reputation for sexual integrity, which might have been at danger due to their prolonged captivity. Indeed, all enslaved individuals were at risk of suffering various forms of abuse, including sexual ones. The abuse of physical and verbal violence was and remains a central component of slavery in general, but women and children were also at much greater risk of sexual abuse than adult men. It is enough to consider the fact that, legally speaking, the rape of a female slave by her master was not even possible, since the woman's sexualized body was not her property. As argued by Jennifer Glancy, slavery is thus configured as an inherently gender relationship of domination that presupposes a surplus of risk and sexual abuse for women and children. As far as the enslaved women of Bona are concerned, the women in question were not privately owned, but rather considered public property belonging to the Grand Duke. As public slaves, they were under the control of the state and, unless sold to private individuals, remained potentially for ransom. Both Christian and Muslim authorities understood that the sexual reputation of female captives was crucial to determine their ransom value. Any harm to their perceived purity or dignity could significantly lower their worth on the ransom market, making it more difficult, if not impossible, for the enslavers to recover the financial investment in their capture. As a result, it was in the interest of all parties involved to ensure that enslaved women were kept in a manner that preserved their value for eventual ransom. This mutual recognition highlights the pragmatic nature of the conflict between Christian and Muslim powers, where economic consideration often took precedence over religious or political hostilities. So in light of this, Ibn Faraj requested that the women be moved to Livorno, where they would be placed under the care of Dr. Benedetto Borromei, who, after physically examining them, found them in good health and spirits. As Tamer Herzig observes, the decision to place the woman under Borromei's protection is particularly striking, given that only a short time earlier he had issued an order that led to the collective rape of enslaved Jewish women from the northern Moroccan city of Tetuan. These women had been captured by Tuscan forces on August 17, 1610, along with their husbands and children, aboard a ship en route to Tunis. The maltreatment of the enslaved female Jewish slave was further brought to light in the petition sent by the leaders of the Jewish community of Livorno to Cosimo II de' Medici, in which the Jewish nation asked to punish Dr. Benedetto Borromei. The doctor at the end was not punished, but the Grand Duke ordered that in future male and female captives must permanently be housed separately. Coming back to the letter of Salviati, the apologetic nature of the letter is evident from the outset, and intended to defend his actions and present a favorable image to the Grand Duke in comparing slaves to nuns. Salviati implied that enslaved women's protection from sexual violence, equating the strict enclosure in female monastic communities to their forced detainment at the slave prison. The comparison between enslaved women and nuns is particularly evocative, given the characteristics of female monasticism in the early modern period. With the Council of Trent, the papacy reaffirmed the obligation of enclosure for nuns, which become a gender-specific obligation rooted in a perceived need to control both the body and the morality of women. This control was seen as an inherent aspect of the female condition. Women needed to be both protected from external dangers and disciplined due to their supposedly weak and desirable nature. The primary justification for female enclosure lay in the need to safeguard the honors of the brides of Christ in a society where female honor was fundamentally linked to physical and sexual integrity. The convent, much like the prison, in this case the arsenal, functioned as a liminal and hybrid institution that simultaneously offered protection and exerted control, ultimately manifesting in the complete subjugation of the female body to the male authority. Although they may not have been tortured, severely mistreated, or sexually abused, their condition was nevertheless one of enslavement, entailing the privation of their freedom and the denial of their civil and legal rights. Okay. Sorry, so this was the petition of the Jewish nation that I forgot to show. Here, as you can see, the Jewish nation lamented that women were housed together with male galley rowers, and they had been violated, and they said that although they were slaves, they should not lose their honor in the sense of sexual honor. So the incident of the arsenal of Pisa allow a comparison to other historical records of violent resistance by enslaved women in the Mediterranean Europe that even that although rare actually existed. So one of the most paradigmatic examples is the 1522 revolt of enslaved women in Hospitaller, Rhodes. According to contemporary accounts, the Ottoman conquest of Rhodes was facilitated by the intervention of the enslaved women, both Muslim and Jewish, who set fire to their master's house. This act of arson was a deliberate attempt to distract their enslavers from the ongoing battle, thus creating an opening for the Ottomans to achieve victory. So this incident highlights an important form of resistance, in which enslaved women actively disrupted the social and military order despite their theoretical lack of freedom. By using violence in a highly strategic and coordinated manner, they asserted their agency and played a decisive role in the outcome of a significant historical event. So the case study analyzed present two forms of resistance. One form involves the submission of complaints and petitions, both written and oral, to which enslaved women assert their Muslim names and stress their family background, as well as the efforts of their relatives in Bona to help them by paying the ransom payments. This type of resistance had a practical goal: to regain freedom or to improve their condition within the confines of a system that denied them autonomy. In contrast, the second form of resistance is more active and disruptive, marked by actions such as burning beds and sheets at their place of imprisonment, thereby intentionally damaging the Tuscan state's property. Unlike the first form, which sought to challenge the system for liberation, the second act was not about escaping slavery, but rather about making a statement. It was an attempt to create disorder, to vocalize dissatisfaction, and to express defiance against the system in a way that could not be ignored. These two examples demonstrate that the resistance did not solely take the form of structured or legal attempts to regain freedom. Enslaved women also resisted through acts of disruption and symbolic defiance, making clear that their condition was not possibly accepted. While the larger system of power constrained their actions, these instances of resistance reveal the complex way in which agency can be exerted, even within highly restrictive environments. So, reconstructing the experiences of enslaved women from Bonn and early modern Livorno challenges traditional narratives of passivity and victimization that portray enslaved individuals, and especially enslaved women, as passive victims of their circumstances. The petition that enslaved women addressed to both Barisoni and the Grand Duke, as well as the rebellious jester in Pisa, demonstrate clear assertions of agency. The enslaved women actively engage with the structures of power that govern their captivity in Tuscany, employing both strategic negotiations through petitions and direct appeal to the state authorities, and acts of defiance, such as protests and property destruction. This active resistance highlights the efforts of enslaved individuals to shape their destinies, even in environments designed to deprive them of such power. Finally, the enslaved women's resistance account shed a light on the intersection of gender and enslavement. We are faced here with a case whose protagonists belong to a doubly marginalized category, both as women and as enslaved people. The marginality resulting from their gender is compounded by their condition as enslaved people. These are individuals who, in theory, should not speak, nor should leave any trace in the archives. Despite the silence of the archives, it has been possible to read through the archival grains and recognize the agency and reaction of these women to their fate. Whether or not their more or less violent actions yield a tangible outcome is of secondary importance. What is truly significant is the recognition of these actions as a deliberate and conscious manifestation of agency, an inherent aspect of human nature that cannot be entirely eradicated, even under conditions of slavery. Thank you.
Thank you, Benedetta, for this wonderful presentation. I truly enjoyed it. Thank you so much. Now with this, we have the Q&A open now. If you have any questions, you can write in the Q&A box, but I'm going to start with my own questions, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Yeah, so with this research project that you're conducting, how do you think that your research navigate the limitations of the historical resources that are available? And I know that you included some of the most important ones in your presentation. So how do you navigate the limitations of those historical sources?
So as I said before, there is actually the biggest problem of this kind of research is to find sources about it. There are not a lot of sources about female slaves, and the main part of them were just names, especially acts, acts of sale, or yes, a certificate of birth, of baptism, but we don't really know what happens to them after these moments. So actually, I'm working especially with judicial sources, with criminal sources, and we are trying to reconstruct as far as possible what we find about these women. We're not interested in just collecting lists of names and numbers of people. So we have a more or less idea of the quantity, even if to obtain a concrete and specific idea of number of enslaved women in the Mediterranean. In the case of Livorno, it's rather impossible. But yeah, we're not interested only in listing, but in trying to reconstruct whenever it's possible some aspects of their lives under.
And why is it is impossible in the case of Livorno? How is Livorno different than other centers?
So for sure, in other centers there could be more other centers like Napoli, Messina, Cagliari, and so on, as centers of slave markets. There are probably more sources because there are, because of the slave markets, there are more women, while Livorno is more military and economic port. So even if women arrived there, it wasn't there where they should have been sold at first instance. So it's just a matter of sourcing. In Livorno, we have more sources. We have more information about galley slavery because of the existence of the Bagno di Livorno, and because of the Bagno was under another jurisdiction compared to the rest of the city. We have more information about galley slaves just because of this different jurisdiction that was specifically directed towards slaves and convicts.
I understand. This is very interesting. How do you think that your analysis of this kind of gender-based violence within the context of female slavery in the early modern period give us a more nuanced understanding of the intersection between gender and race in this period, because it was fascinating to know a lot about non-European female slaves like Turkish slaves and other from other places. How does your analysis give us a better understanding of this intersection?
So this is actually a very complicated question, and this opens a big parenthesis on the debate on how whether is it possible or not to talk about race in the early modern time, because we are still in a period in which the concept of race, as we are used to think about it, and concept of race that is it will be linked to the Atlantic slave trade is still absent. Slavery is a matter, first of all, of religion and also of geographical origin. But the concept of race, I mean, I think is still lacking, and there are different studies that support this thesis. There are some scholars who actually support the idea that instead there are first, I would say firstizations or racialization, but like the Tamar Herzig found this very interesting case in which a captain in his diary writes how they captured some women from sub-Saharan Africa that were black, and one of them was pregnant, and the baby, when he was born, he was white, and then the slave just put some potion on him, and he became black. So also the skin color is linked more to a geographical origin and not something transmitted with with blood. So it's very complicated and not clear. So.
Right. Yes. So this was a very interesting case study. So in terms of the primary materials that you're dealing with for this project, what kind of documents are you working with other than lists of names? What other documents?
I'm working mostly with criminal trials. Because my objective would be to do more a social history of these enslaved women, but as I told, they were part of the everyday life of society, but still they were at the margins of it, so they were not considered how to say, they were so ordinary that they were not worthy of being remembered in the sources, except when they did something illegal, and thus they were persecuted by the courts, the criminal courts. So where I'm searching for the most of my material.
Okay, and what are the main archives that you're working? I know that you're working in different cities, and you were telling me before. But what are the main archives?
So for the first part of this work, I've worked on the archives in Pisa, Florence, and Livorno. And again, Livorno, especially in the fund of the governor of the city, the criminal court. And for the cases of Isabella della Madre di Dio, there was the Archivio della Dottrina della Fede, so the archives of the Inquisition. And now for the project, I should go also to Naples and other archives in southern Italy. And yeah.
Okay, wonderful. And so is this the research that you presented today, is this part of the FemSMed project at Tel Aviv University? Can you elaborate on this project a little bit?
So this project is an ERC project that will last 5 years. So we are right now at the very beginning of it because it started on October 1st, 2024. And the aim of the project is exactly to try to give voice and to shape light on the presence of female slaves, and to show how they were actually not only present, but how they influenced Mediterranean society, how they were included, and how and how to show how not only that the Mediterranean space was not free from slavery, but also that domestic slavery was part of it, and also that enslaved women somehow contributed to the to the essence of the Mediterranean society, and because these women, contrary to the men on the galleys, they usually did not come back to their home country. They remained here in Italy. A lot of them had children who were integral part of society. And so there is this case, this great study by Kate Lowe about the children of enslaved women, especially Black African women, already in the 15th, 16th century, that were abandoned at the Ospedale degli Introvabili. So yeah.
Okay, so it's not limited to early modern period.
Yeah. Yeah, so the project is from the 16th to the 19th century, and we are divided. I mean, I'm studying Italy together with other two PhD students. We are the other colleagues study in Spain, and so on. Others who studies France, and so we are trying to give a sort of general overview on the phenomena.
Okay, and then is there like an upcoming publication on the project? How is this research going to be published and available?
We should publish articles in peer-reviewed journals. Hopefully, the talk I gave you tonight will be published in a peer-reviewed journal. I'm just waiting for the response to the referee. There are also some PhD students, so the outcomes of the research will become their PhD dissertations. And at the end of the 5 years, we be hopefully be ready to publish at least 1 or 2 volumes on female slavery in the Mediterranean. So there is also a database that we are working on. This is more obviously from a quantitative point of view. Yes, so these are.
Yeah, that was actually my follow-up question. Is this going to be digitized, the data or your analyses, other than publications in peer-reviewed journals? Is the data going to be available to other scholars?
Yeah, it's going to be. I don't know when and how, but I think the first results should be available not in so much times, maybe already next year. Yes, but the database will be strictly quantitative. So number of slaves found in sources, when possible, names, place of origin, status of enslavement, name of the baptism, if they are baptized, if they have any children, any information we will be able to collect will be put in the database.
Okay, thank you for confirming that. So now I have one question that is more through like an art historical perspective. I was wondering how the representations of these like female slaves were different than male slaves, because usually in male cases we do see shaved heads and beards, and other than their body language of distorted faces and bodies, what else is a characteristic of an enslaved female body?
So actually, the visual representation of enslaved women is not very different from the representation of servants. So this is what makes it more complicated also to find traces of them. Sometimes, like in one of the sketches that I've showed at the beginning of the presentation, there was the depiction of 2 Black Africans women, and they were recognizable by the color of the skin and also by the description there was the artist who described as 2 Moorish slaves, 2 Marie schiave. But otherwise, it's like I don't know, actually, I think that this is the same problem also with galley slaves, because I mean, we recognize male slaves by the knocked on their head, but for the rest, they actually they are dressed as galley convicts, and if they wear a beret, the red beret, they weren't recognizable. I mean, they were recognizable by their physical features, but yes, the trousers, the shirts, and everything else was the same of the convicts. So obviously it depends a lot. Well, if you are studying, but you know it better than me. If you're studying visual representation, which the power of the Christian so of the Grand Dukes has to be emphasized. Obviously, the Turk is easily recognizable and is in a position of being dominated and of being vanquished and so on. But I'm referring in particular to the sketchbook of Ignazio Fabroni, that is the same sketchbook from which I took the images of the slaves, of the women slaves. These are sketchbooks of the everyday life on the galley. They're not meant to be. They are private sketchbooks in which he what he sees, and a lot of times it's not possible to understand who is who. So I think it depends also by the context of the.
Okay, so basically more like textual resources help you rather than art historical or artistic representations of such figures, unless there are representations of trophies that include bodies and humans, right? Is that, and by the body language of them, what exactly do you mean? Is that other than the bound hands? Is there anything else? Any chains? Any other features?
No, I would say no, because for the said dresses are the same for the servants, so the chains are the only the hands are the only distinguished feature.
I know. Yes, thank you so much. Sorry, I've been keeping you. I know you told me that what a long day you had, and then I keep asking questions. Sorry about that. Thank you so much, Dr. Benedetta Chizzolini, for spending the last hour with us and sharing your wonderful and fascinating research with us. We enjoyed it, and if there are any follow-up questions, I'm happy to connect you with Dr. Chizzolini. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We hope to see you again next week, same time, same link. I know the daylight saving time changed in Europe, so we're back at 11 p.m. Florence time. So our regular time. Thank you everybody. I wish everyone a very good and pleasant evening. Thank you, Benedetta, for being with us tonight.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you.